I want to say we're excited to have you here. We're excited to have this conversation with Dan Gillette. As we talk about doing good in STEM. So again, I think most of you on the call know my name is Lynn Mayo, I'm CEO of RePicture. We currently have a program running for college and STEM students interested in science, technology, engineering, and math, or STEM. So you can still apply to the program if you're looking for something meaningful to do this summer. And before we start today's webinar, I want to mention next week's webinar, which will be on Wednesday also at 12 o'clock. And that webinar is going to be presented by a panel of scientists and engineers from AECOM, which is a large engineering science company. They're going to be talking about Black history and culture from a science and engineering perspective. So with everything happening this summer, we're really excited to have, I think it's going to be a very important talk next week. So I hope you join us for that. This week, we're excited to have Dan Gillette. Dan has spent his career mapping pathways between what technology and creativity allow and what real-world users appreciate. He earned his master's degree at Harvard Graduate School of Education with a focus on cognition and instructional design. Dan is a product developer and has developed technology products to assist individuals with autism. He's worked as a lead consultant in a national student assessment system, and he led the design of a virtual reality therapy environment to treat children with psychiatric disabilities more effectively. Dan's also taught product design at UC Berkeley and Stanford University and is a regular presenter at national technical conferences. So again, we're really excited to have Dan today. This webinar is going to be a little different in that we're going to have more of a conversation. So if you have a question for Dan, please put it in the chat. You can either do a group chat or you can chat, a private chat to me, Lynn Mayo. And then also at the end, we'll unmute and people can ask your questions directly. So again, Dan, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, so our summer program theme this week is innovation. So I want to start with a question regarding that. And I just want to get your opinion on how do you think innovation and social good go together?
Mm-hmm. I mean, from my perspective, that's the point. Unfortunately, I live in San Francisco, I'm in the Bay Area, and I see lots of examples where a lot of people don't catch that. But, I think innovation, one of the things is what is innovation is an interesting question in and of itself. Because I think the public media and when we're younger, we're constantly taught to innovation is a big, bold move. It's something brand new. And the reality is that the stuff that really changes the world is more incremental, and it might be that a lot of people had never seen a way of solving a problem a certain way or a certain technology, but you can often trace back decades where lots of people in lots of different pockets have been developing the tools, the methods, the trial and error to get to that point. And you're finally when you get to be anointed as an innovator, you were lucky enough to be at the right point in time on that path of change where something started to work. But actually some of the best innovations or things that we tout as the most innovative have been the longest in coming. And so I think one of the things is to think about, is innovation about being bold and brash and just showing your creativity? Or is it about actually solving real world problems in ways that are better than before and do the most good with the least amount of resources from a sort of business perspective or damage, from more of a social perspective? How does it slot in and fit? Innovation is often a fit thing that people don't realize. It's when somebody finally figures out how to take a bunch of things that were new at one point and get them to fit so that they don't feel like they don't belong. So you can start using it, so you can start having value in it. And so when you think about it that way and you think about the context, then what you're really going for, a true innovation, is equitable in the biggest way possible, is thoughtful in how it affects other parts of the ecosystem it lives in. And so in my mind, in a very literal way, innovation should be seen as tied to a balanced, civic world.
I love that. I love what you're saying is that innovation doesn't have to be that big thing that we all imagine, the reality that it's all those smaller parts that eventually make that bigger thing.
Yeah.
Great. So, so what are some examples maybe of you know, the innovation that was kind of used for social good?
I mean, that's a tough question because, I mean, again, like the myth of like Silicon Valley, you know, one of the things about the venture capital world is, you know, the world needs this. So like, even in that case, even if it like on balance historically turns out to not be, you know, that product or whatever, it was intended, you know, at some point in the pitch, it was like, oh, this is going to change the world for the better. And so I think it's just hard to think of a single example. Everything is such a double-edged sword. You know, I think that a lot of people don't understand like how much the smartphone has enabled human capacity in a good way, in this big juggernaut of consumerism. But on the other hand, all the things that I see that are major advancements, from things like helping doctors instantaneously recognize whether or not someone should receive a drug for a brain aneurysm that, if given in a certain circumstance, saves their life, and in another circumstance with a very, very thin distinction in the moment while you're looking at someone who's coming into the ER, would kill them or have a very serious side effect. Now, all that's enabled by mobile technology, by artificial intelligence in the cloud, all these things. So, you know, Facebook is used by doctors and political activists, and at the same time by people working against them. And I think that one of the issues is that when we talk about an innovative product, we have to talk more about how society uses it. This is not a guns don't kill people, people kill people argument. I don't believe that. I feel like every choice I make as a designer, or I encourage in my team, or is encouraged to me by members in my team, is affects human behavior. So we do have this ability, but we're not perfect at it, and people have their own agency, and these are tools. So I think the thing is to keep reminding yourself, why did you start this? I think that's a big mistake that happens. And I think for those of you, you know, I live more in technology, but I believe a lot of you are involved in bio stuff and other types of innovation. And I think one of the things that's easy to forget is you start a project with a specific purpose that's important to you, and hopefully also important to the world. And then when you get into the technical details of it, that is so consuming and interesting that you can forget, you know, if someone asks you why you're doing this, you'd say, I'm doing it for this better good. But then in the reality, like, you could spend a year or two perfecting something technical until you forget whether or not it matters. You know, and it might be beautiful as a scientific thing, or as a technological thing, or as an object of design, but that beauty isn't necessarily the fastest way to create impact for that little thing, but it was the thing you were assigned with. So a big part of this is just simply remembering, why did I start, and constantly reminding yourself, how does this fit into that big picture? Are we moving towards that goal, or are we moving to satisfy another itch, like that perfect aware, you know, learning, doing a science experiment to know something so completely more than anyone else, even if we're weeks past what we needed to know to move this product forward, things like that.
No, I think that's really interesting. And I think that's important. You know, part of what the students are going to be doing this week is, some of them are going to choose to go after the Innovation Award, which is really doing research on innovative products or innovations, you know, that were innovative at their time, but important to have them think about, well, what was the benefit of it? It's not just simply innovative.
So I do have one example, just like if you're going to be looking at that stuff, where to look. But unfortunately, again, like who controls history? Certain people get erased, and certain aspects aren't always available. But the OXO Good Grip vegetable peeler It's that vegetable peeler that we all have, or we have a knockoff of, and it's got that curve and it fits in your hand really nice. So a friend of mine, Patricia Moore, was one of the founders of OXO and lead designer on that project back in around 1980, I think. And the interesting thing was the brief was kept secret from the world for years, like a decade. It was intended for people with arthritis. And what they saw was the way that people who had arthritis didn't want arthritis-specific kitchen aids because they'd be kind of embarrassed about being in their kitchen, and that's a social space. The other thing is that the supply chain for adaptive technology like that versus general consumer technology was smaller and harder to reach, so your items would be more expensive. And so what they did was they made sure that their object had yuppie appeal. It was Time Magazine named it Product of the Year that year and said, all yuppies love it. And yuppie is kind of a dated term maybe for some of you, but you know, think about bros. You know, people who are like really into their appearance and look and status, you know, Instagram famous people, you know, this is their thing. And the idea was if this was something that kids would buy for their parents, then it would end up in their kitchen. And the other thing that they did, which was amazing, was they also knew that once it had that appeal, it would be knocked off immediately. So they were the first company to, without any fanfare, create their own knockoffs and created subsidiaries to produce the knockoffs. And they're like, we feel everything in this vegetable peeler is here with purpose. But if there has to be a knockoff, certain things matter more than others. And if you're just going for look to sell it, you're going to miss those. So we better make our own knockoffs. So what you got in Target, unbranded, was theirs as well. And that, so it wasn't so much that they just invented a better vegetable peeler that allowed people with arthritis and other physical limitations in their hands to cook better and happier, but it also got a better vegetable peeler for everyone. We had, you know, I have like 3 in my drawer without thinking about it. They just appear. And they also understood the context. How would this end up in your drawer? How would this make you feel if you were using it, if it looked like a medical device versus a beautiful consumer object? How do we ensure that if there's competition, that competition cares about the same things we care about, like ergonomics? So I think that's, you know, to me, it's not, no electricity flows through it. It was created with, you know, shaving foam and putting it in a bunch of people different hands by a tiny team that just really, but it was a diverse team that involved marketing and sales as well as design, as well as I can never say the word, people who study anthropomorphic, you know, how people are shaped and moved. There's your example.
I love it. And that is such a great example of, you know, so often when we think of innovation, we think of something big, you know, we think of the smartphone. And I love that the fact that innovation could be something is what appears to be as basic as a vegetable peeler, but really has a lot more to it. So I love
yeah,
that
and change the world of kitchen gadgets. You know, I think we all, especially if you're a casual kitchen user, now everything's more usable in the kitchen, and it all started very much with that. And stand mixers and everything, in part that this team was hired to work on those. But on the other hand, it was also changed expectations overnight without anyone consciously thinking about it. But it's like, if this feels good in my hand and it works and it doesn't lose its sharpness, why does everything else in my kitchen not? And suddenly there was a marketplace for better stuff.
Great. We actually have a question from one of the students, and you mentioned there was a diverse team that put together the you know, the new vegetable peeler. Why do you think diversity is important in innovation?
It's important for, I mean, there's so many reasons, and I think they're the same as why diversity in general is important in most cases. But I think there are probably a couple of reasons that are, it's an absolute requirement in good innovation. And one of them is because you're trying to, everybody's different. You know, one of the things my work has taught me is how diverse people are, but also how little the things are that make them in a human way so different. You know, the way that humans perceive difference is small things. If I were to group people together from a capability standpoint or a sensibility standpoint or a cognitive, you know, way of thinking, they'd be incredible. There'd be almost no outliers, you know, as a big group. But then we all are aware of all these differences, and all these differences affect us in our lives, and they're from small things. So the thing is like, you can't know a group, you can only know individuals. And if you don't include enough individuals who represent variety and diversity, you're creating something for one person. It's a huge mistake. You know, what's the point? And where does that get you? No matter what your interests are, even if they're completely mercenary, you're not going to sell a lot. You know, and if they're beyond that, and you just want to, and your focus is on trying to improve lives or whatever, then of course it's critical. The other reason is it's the diversity of mindset and diversity of perception and experience and how all that comes together. I get to do the work I do because I've been perceived as not typical. I have some profound learning disabilities. I was originally a musician and a 2-time dropout. My first career was as a musician, and I fell into this by accident because certain skill sets carried over and someone else thought that would be interesting as a way of breaking up, you know, or breaking through the blind spots that teams were having. And that is critical to, you know, the ability to look at different perspectives and have that be part of it, and to see different things and way things that do connect and how they can connect, and understand the circumstances and observe people with different ways. No one can observe an individual interacting with a product or responding to a therapy or whatever completely. It takes a team of a lot of different perspectives to even get close to that. And that's why it matters so much. And it's also a great opportunity for design. It's changing because design is becoming more common as an internal function of organizations, which I wholly support. They've been behind that movement. The sad thing is that now it becomes another role that's understood. When I started out in the 90s, every single product designer was different, like completely different. And your whole point was you were the weird one who didn't fit. And it was miserable in many ways because you weren't accepted and you weren't part of the team. But on the other hand, anything that made you outside of the norm was a way in and gave you value in an odd way, in a way that was not always fully accepted, but understood as important. And I feel like we're losing that a little bit. But I think when we talk about diversity, I do think like being able to discuss your, you know, the way you get a job with me is 2 things. You come in and you say, I've worked on this. It was interesting or important in this way. And that might not be a success. It might be relearned or whatever. And this was specifically my contribution. That's one critical thing. I get a lot of smart folks who come in who just think they're really cool, and they never tell me what they did, and they can't, you know, they just never practiced. I want to know not only what was the cool thing you were attached to, but what was your role. And it doesn't have to be huge. I just want to understand that you understood how you contributed and how you fit. And the other piece would be to describe something, an inkling, an idea, a perception, doesn't, you know, that relates to whatever you're coming in to talk to me about to get that job. That's what I think is the nice thing here, is if you can do those 2 things at all, then now getting through the door might be hard, but when you talk about diversity and things, this is a way to make the workforce more diverse, because people respond to that. You show your importance by saying those, you know, giving examples of those 2 things. And so for folks who have been most shut out from certain situations, they often are the best at articulating those things. They might have an alternative perspective because of, you know, their experience, and are probably more used to having to fight to show their value so they can explain explicitly what worked. So those are strengths, and that's a way to break down those barriers. And so it's important, and it's also a means to that diversity. But we have a long way to go.
Okay, great. No, I appreciate that. And I think it's interesting also. I mean, diversity, there's just so many levels of diversity and so important. I mean, obviously having that race diversity is really important to have the gender, but even other types. It's
Psychiatric,
really all,
cognitive, cultural.
yeah,
And the thing is that a lot of those things get tied together. And we like to separate them out, but we're all a Venn diagram of all of that. And society, how society has treated you and offered you or not offered you opportunities affects all those other things as well. And it's unfortunate, but it's also it can be turned into a strength.
okay, great. Which maybe leads into our next issue, especially
Mm-hmm.
with the diversity for the race is obviously a big issue now, and other social justice issues. So next week our theme is social justice, which obviously is getting a lot of attention, like it should right now. But my question to you is, do you think STEM professionals have a role to play in social justice?
Totally. I mean, so one of the interesting things is I was sort of at a turnover period in the history of modern technology, digital technology, still pretty early when I was coming on the scene, but also becoming kind of manageable and settled. So I got to meet and in some cases be mentored by the real old guard. And sort of be a bridge between then and now in that period of time. And so one of the things is a lot of that old guard includes things like physicists who worked on the atomic bomb. And, their computers are used for this or that. And their job is to build missiles and, or target, the first AI chip I got to work with, it came with one program on it, and that program was to identify the tails of fighter jets so you could shoot at them. So it's like, if you just think this is a tool and you don't think about the broader implications, one, you miss the opportunity to create a really useful tool because that tool has to fit in someone's hand, as we were saying, like with OXO, or in someone's mind or whatever. So it affects its usability, but the other thing is it affects its purpose and outcome. Why did someone pick up that tool to use it? And how might they be encouraged to use it just out of, it's easier to use it this way than that way. It might be easier to use a drone to attack someone than to spread goodwill, but drones are used also in agriculture and other things. You can't say the category is good or bad, but you have to think about your role in moving that category into a certain area. And sometimes it's back to I've been offered opportunities to do dream projects in levels of complexity and the amount of resource, but their purpose made me sick. And that was an internal thing for me. And I think that there's a lot of work going on right now, especially in machine learning, to bring control back. Scientists and technologists saying we let go too much. I have colleagues at Citrus at Berkeley who, are leading the call for the UN to establish guidelines on ethical use of artificial intelligence and machine learning. They know that it'd be easier in many ways to have for society to have robots autonomously decide who to kill on a battlefield than to create a car that drives safely through the streets of San Francisco. And so, when you make something easier or better, you have to think about the consequences for society and for yourself. I also know a lot of people who have been permanently scarred by how their stuff has been sort of distorted. So you can't divorce yourself from it and say that's not what you do. I worked on a congressional funded project for a number of years to create more equitable voting technology. And one of the things that was really frustrating, we were developing standards, we were helping companies develop new things, we were helping states choose more equitable systems. That was exciting. The thing is that we were at a point where, while it wasn't perfect, what was happening in the polling place was pretty good, and we were looking at incremental gains that needed to keep happening. But the thrust of this money and the number of people involved really needs to be focused on things like voter guides, on things like the most important one was we were just switching over to digital roll books, which you're hearing a lot about now. A lot of people being kept from the polls is because of a digital roll book being hard to use or being manipulated in a certain way. So that's really just like a database about who gets to vote. But it used to be paper, now it's digital. And we saw that as the greatest threat. And we were, by law, not allowed to approach or even really discuss that was the threat to our election system. We were as scientists and technologists, we were supposed to stay in our lane of the polling place. But if you can't get there, if you're not allowed access to the polling place, what does it matter? And that's where, all right, do I have to become a political activist now? Even though that's not my thing, what is my role at that point? Do I just quit? Do I, if my role is to do more equitable voting, it doesn't matter if I'm a technologist or an activist. I have a skill set to apply, and where that leads me is important. And that's an important, way to think about it.
Yeah, so that's really an interesting story and situation.
Mm-hmm.
And as these students go into their professional life, they might have that situation, right? Whether it may be something they're working on technology or science, and there's an ethical issue regarding that, or the priority should be something different. What advice do you have for students when they're facing kind of that ethical question?
Yeah, I've been grappling a lot in the last few years. I don't know if it's a change in role because I'm in a different place. I'd love to keep doing the work that I always used to do, but as you get older, you have a responsibility to open doors for other folks and to train and to be more of a manager and set the agenda. And I don't know if it's that grappling with that change of being someone who got their hands really dirty and now is more of a manager, or if it's a historic change, or if I just made a big mistake. Because the thing is that so much of my work for about 20 years was the context is the thing that I really can't change much of. But what I can do is give the individual tools to be more visible, to be more autonomous, to be more empowered in that context. And that had been my focus, more on the individual who's working in the structure. And I think I gave up too early without really investigating the ability to change the context. I think I just, as a younger person, just accepted it. And I think that was fed to me as well. It was a combo, but for whatever reason. And now I feel like instead of working inside the bucket of a context, I need to change the bucket. I need to change the shape I need to be part of that change. And I find myself ill-equipped to do that because so much of my work has been about the individual. And I think we need to do both. And I think I think I skewed too far. So as going into this now, in this moment in time, it's also a matter of what's available. Most people didn't live within platforms like they do now. Platforms weren't as proprietary. They weren't as all-encompassing and empowering. It was more individual tools and you made your own platform. So maybe that's part of the shift as well. So I think now is to think about how can your skill set be applied to changing the context. And if because that's always been the issue. Disability is as an example, is actually, the definition of disability is a cultural one. You have impairments, you might be different with perception or physical capability in some way. You might do something a little differently, but it's only in the context of culture that you become disabled. And so the thing is that your environment decides that for you. And that's what I've been working on, is if your environment is an impediment, what are those tools, that make it not so anymore? And that changes culture and it changes the concept of disability, and to a certain degree, work to change the environment. But what if we wholesale change the platform? It's a big ask, but it's also a time where we have more capability and people are more used to working integrated in an integrated way to work towards that. And the technologies are more integrated and the systems, the global system and all is more integrated. And I think a lot of the sparks of really backpedaling on progress is because of the there's not a socket for certain people to be part of that new world, and be part of the, and it's where those breaks happen in the system. And so work on the system more. Don't just think that you're a person who can only do a small thing. One of the teams that I'm mentored this year are 3D printing clay cook pots for the developing world, where a lot of cooking is still done on these clay stoves. And their big advancement is the last great project to try and make a change in how many cook pots could be made at a certain price, was in the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. And we were sitting across the table from each other, and it just hit me like, that's what we were taught to think like, but there's no limiter on what you've just put together. Why not millions in the next couple of years? You broke that limitation, but we still have in our minds, it's an incremental improvement. It's algorithmic improvement from their mentors, who did it 20 years ago, who only did like 20,000. They're going to do 200,000. No, you can do millions, but we totally missed it because of our mindset. And I think like we're in that period of time that also gets back to the responsibility, because you screw it up too much, quickly things can go wrong really fast in certain areas. So it's also the checks and balances and the rigor. I think that we're in a period in time where doing things rigorously, scientific method, following design principles, things like that, we're being encouraged to push them aside for speed. But we need them now more than ever. If I got a product out and 60 people in the first version used it and it went really wrong, I only have to worry about those 60 people. If 1 million people, which is common now, use my version 1 or my next change, that could be catastrophic, especially at a certain time. Suppose it's something related to the media and it's a week before a big presidential election. Boom. I'm lucky because some of my first projects were life and death technologies. Like if this thing turned off, someone would stop breathing. And that was a really good experience to have as a young designer. I wish that more people have that experience and treat everything they do with that same rigor.
No, I love that. And I appreciate very much what you just said about treating your design, for those who are doing designs, treat those with vigor, because it does. I mean, obviously not everyone's going to be that life, the immediate life and death situation like you indicated, but so much of what STEM scientists and engineers do ultimately do have an important role in people's lives, and to have that rigor.
Yeah, and I think like, design has been an abstraction always from general problem solving. So the reality is like, for instance, like the undergraduates that I work with now are almost all bio and data science, but they need design probably more than any other. Their fields are emerging now, where other fields, the design aspect has kind of plateaued for a while. We don't need to really rethink the methodology so much until we get to the next plateau. But in things like biotech, bioengineering, and things like data science, we are in that. That's where you have to come up with new methods and new checks and balances. And so those are the students I'm working with, and they're doing the most interesting things right now, because they're the emerging fields and they're the new Wild Wests compared to computer science. Computer human interaction was in the 90s, when that was my Wild West.
Great. I think it's also interesting that you talk about the importance of getting that design early in your career, because I come from very different, I'm a civil engineer, so I come very different from the design, but that is one advice I always give to civil engineers, is try to get some experience doing design at the beginning of your career, even if you then go on to do more policy type things or more management type things. Having that initial design, I think is really important. So it's interesting. I think also interesting, you talked about, and I think again, I'm relating to it from my career, that as a young professional, you're really working on, like you said, we're helping that individual. And I also thought at that level, I didn't have the opportunity to comment on the system. And then I love your suggestion to younger people in their career, don't assume that you can't have impact to the system. Do your job with the individual, but really look at impacting the system. I think is a great thing.
And I think it also gets back to the diversity thing. So if you are going to work on the system, apply your skill set and find people who have other skill sets. I'm not saying, like I'd be I'd be a terrible lobbyist or politician, and so I have to find folks who we are aligned in our purpose, and we're able to work together from a methodological perspective, or develop ways to work together, or willing to work on that. And together we have to work on this. That's really the thing. So it's a shifting team is the other thing. Not only do you need a diverse team, but there's no set, one of the things I say to startups is your product decides to a certain degree who needs to be on this team, but this moment in time and who all of you as co-founders are to begin with, your strengths, your weaknesses, your interests, your style, all that decides even more who should be on that team as a founding team. And so that diversity is ever changing. It's never set. You need one of this, one of that. That's the road to failure. To me, that's not diversity. That's just a box of crayons that never get to draw.
Great. We have a question from a student. The question is, how can STEM students use their experiences to be activists in maybe a unique way?
I think one of the most important things is to become a storyteller. Yeah, that's a skill. We go back to the beginning of this discussion. I'm like, how do you get a job with me? You tell me a good story. You just got to have certain content to it, but you also have to be able to tell me that story. And that's an unfortunate thing, because some people, that in itself makes, we have to also watch for the biases that introduces. What if you're not a great storyteller? What if you have a cognitive disability that makes that difficult? What if you're really shy? But these are some of the things, like if there's a skill that I think you need to acquire, even if it goes against your nature, it's storytelling. Because seldom do you actually get to be part of developing that thing that changes everything. And the reality is that's just a moment in time, because once that exists, everyone's thinking about the next opportunity. So that's like a never ending cycle. But what you can be a part of is explaining what you learned and what it means to you and what it might mean to the world, and so my work in autism was interesting because we made advancements in how we could do computer interfaces to help kids communicate in ways that we totally didn't expect for kids who couldn't talk, developing tools for them. But the real thing is that by applying our methodology, we learned certain things about the context, the social context that is typical for a kid who can't speak, who has autism, and how other people view and treat that person, and also some of the ways that person is really trying to interact with their world and with other people, but is missed. Like one thing is we often put a camera on a user who's using a new device. And by putting a camera on just one person, instead of looking at a whole social interaction, we got to see for the first time micro communications that were happening that people miss. We're not wired for, but when we saw it on camera and was just watching that person. And that ended up with, I got to be on a subcommittee for that developed the new definition, the clinical definition of autism in the early 2000s. So the clinical definition was socially based. It was all of these symptoms that were social, like how you interact with other people or whatever. And most of the new clinical, it's not perfect. It has a lot of legacy in it, but that clinical definition is now about things you could actually measure, and things that relate, not just measure, but that they relate to what you might do to help. So it was so frustrating for us as designers and engineers and things, was that autism has this huge range of features, and everyone's different. And nothing about anything in their education plans or their medical plans helped us find a starting point to know this would be a good place to start with something, you know, assistive technology or whatever. And so getting to a diagnostic criteria that was more functional and more related to how we might help that person achieve their goals versus society's goals was critical. And it was really weird to be a designer, even though I have a background in cognitive science, at that table with the people I was sitting with. But our methodology allowed us to see that. And now other things have been able to happen because, you know, that was an example of changing the platform instead of the, you know, a tool for the individual. We failed. Our tool for the individual, terrible. But what we learned from it and the story we were able to tell changed the whole context around how typical people view, you know, neurotypical people view non-neurotypical individuals. And a long way to go, but it was at least a start. And so storytelling is the first step. If you can't explain what you learned or why it's important, you know, why what you know and other people don't because of your skill set and because of your work experience, then if you can't make that, if you can't help them understand it, they can't get behind it. They can't change. Society can't change.
I love that advice. I wish I had heard that 30 years ago, because I think I've come to realize that of how important that storytelling is and really the communication. That's the best way to communicate. So I encourage everyone.
Well, and I mean, and on the very micro level, just all those times when you're that junior person and your boss is just like, we're going to keep doing it this way. And it's like, but this way's better, or that's a dead end. And it's like, and you're just going at each other and you're getting yourself in trouble. But if you can tell the story, there's a likelihood, oh, I see how this is going to play out in the big picture. And it's even a way for them to not even have to admit they didn't see it, because now you see it together in this world you've constructed, and then they see the solution as well. And you just suck up that you saw it first. You're like, yes, I'm going to do it your way because that makes sense. You know, that comes back to storytelling really in the end.
Yeah, we got to find a way to get them to be teaching storytelling in the class.
And it's happening. Like the NSF has a storytelling, a whole national program to take, you know, there's a storytelling club at like the Lawrence Berkeley Labs. You know, I wish more people took advantage of it or knew about it. And yeah, and it tends to happen sooner. And that's also a way for you to decide for yourself constantly, is what I'm doing working towards my goal, or, you know, our real goal, or just interesting and fun or challenging, you know, is the story you tell about it. If the story just includes you, then probably you've gone down one of those challenge rabbit holes that's so, for folks in STEM, that can be so fulfilling. And you can say, we're going to learn something new. But again, where does that fit in the bigger, where does that knowledge fit in the bigger picture?
Great. We're getting some great questions from the students. So thank you, students, for continuing to have these questions. This question is, you mentioned technologies and innovations are often double-edged swords, and sometimes the pluses and minuses aren't clear. How can we evaluate and better understand the potential impacts of a technology, especially for new and emerging technologies?
Well, I mean, there's so many different ways to think about that. And that is something I think this group needs to be a big part of. We all need to be a part of it. And especially, you know, what's so cool, like I'll use data science as an example. I've gotten to work with a lot of the, you know, great minds of my generation in data science, but for them, it was more theoretical. Data wasn't in the ether that you could just grab a feed and incorporate it. You had to create a data set. You had to, you know, and so now I work with 20-year-olds who breathe this stuff. And they might not, like, theoretically be anywhere near on that level of the people who are training them, but the people who are training them can't do and will never be able to do what that 20-year-old is doing as far as just being in it. And so part of that is, this is something where we have to not let the old people decide this stuff. You know, it needs to be a combination. I have experience. I can tell you all the ways I've seen stuff go sideways, and you don't as a younger person, you know? And so I need to be there to help you understand from a historical perspective, but you need to be most of the driver to help me understand what it actually is. You know, and it's and you don't do it and stop. You don't create a standard and say, this is how we test. So one example, one of the big ones right now is decipherable machine learning. So we now have algorithms making algorithms, and an input and a result and a black box in the middle. That has to be human readable. If we can't audit that process, we can't learn from it. And so it's not so much, often you can't prevent anything bad from happening. What you're trying to prevent is systemic failures and dangers. And so either small things happening over and over again, you want to learn from those breaks. And also that if you can stem the smaller things, you never get to the big catastrophe. Because the reality is that one of my mentors worked in city planning, and he used to say, our buildings are as good as the last earthquake, and earthquakes are always different. You know, there's only so much you can do to prevent, and you can't let that fear completely stop you, but you can do your best to not build on previous failures, and to know how, you know, to be creative in how things might go. So I think like that's a big part of how do we prevent that? How do we know something is difficult? We don't, I mean, the problem is we're really bad at it. You know, in the moment, it's hard to see. And that's, again, where that outsider perspective can be really important. And someone who can move between, you know, someone who has an outsider perspective, but is also able to observe and sit at the center of something as well, is critical. Because I think a lot of times we look back 40 years ago and cringe. No matter how you might have been lauded as like the most ethical person, and then you're like, oh my God, I said that, I believed that. The thing is from the inside, you're incremental. It's that incremental nature. You might have been better than your peers in a certain way, but the whole system was junk. You know, and that's, you know, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But as long as it keeps moving forward, and we have to accept that. And I think the other thing is, right now, we don't allow people to come back from their mistakes. And a lot of people make mistakes and then feign at apologies or desire to change. But a lot of other people, part of the whole human process is to screw up. And I know that pre-internet, I've said things that, you know, I'm totally embarrassed about, and I learned from it. And I wish it never happened. But it, you know, whatever, you know, in an interpersonal situation or a professional situation or a product design, whatever. And we have to allow the opportunity for people to take ownership of that, be called out on it, and take ownership of it, but then also be a part of the solution if they really honestly want to try, and understand that we all have these flaws. And sometimes some of the folks with the most who have a skill set that's the most unique also have the most flaws on the other side, and that we need that person. So we have to figure out how everyone can come together, and we can't just say you can't be a part of this game anymore if they honestly are willing to be part of that change. And so I think it's a combo of, now we're recognizing these issues better, but we also are limiting the ability of folks to do trial and error. There's this fear of, what if I do the wrong thing? And you should live with that fear. You should try and do the right thing always. I hate the term fail fast. You should always try to be doing it right. But when you screw up, you should also be given the space to learn from it and to own it, you know, and that's part of learning from it and come out of it with changed by it.
Great. One of the things you mentioned early on was, you know, looking at the data, and the younger people are typically better, look at data. And I just want to remind anyone on the call that we do have one of the awards we have going on right now is looking at big data. So make sure you check that out if you're interested in it. But when the students asked is why did you choose, or how do you get involved in data science?
Well, what I love about being a designer is I get to hone and use a skill set that that suits me as a core skill set. But what's cool is I have a short attention span for domains. I'm just curious, but I'm not, and I think, and I want to try and make the world better in some way for people. But I'm bad at prioritizing, one person over another. I don't think that's right, and their needs, and I at a certain level, so like this disability versus that ability. I've never been a specialist in that way, and so at a certain point, there's just need and room for improvement, and that's what's been drives my creativity and my interest. And so what's exciting about that is I'm able to apply this tool set that makes it worthwhile to be involved in new domains over and over again, be that autism, data science, voting. I did a project on air quality in underserved communities. And I get to become on a slice, a bit of an expert is a requirement on that slice that I'm working on, but then I move on to something else. And so data science, what's cool is that that's permeating everything right now. And so I get to work with these amazing folks where that's the thing that drives them, and that's their tool set, and that's their creativity and motivation, and they are going to stay in that domain. I am not good at that. I need to move around. I need to explore different things. And so that's how I found out that I shouldn't continue my education as a cognitive scientist, where I'd be pushed more and more to, I made a mild discovery in graduate school, and all my mentors were like, this is your career. And I'm like, no, I don't want to just know this better and better. What else have I not? I'm at the beginning. What else is out there? And product design lets me do that. And for another person diving in all the way, that's what they want to do. And what I like is being able to be a part of these discoveries and helping take that knowledge and make it more, give it a practical purpose. So I can have someone who does dive deep can hand something off to me, and we can work on it together, and then I can keep going with it. And that gives them that ultimately that impact they wanted, but they can keep diving deep at what they do well, and vice versa, and so that's back to that diversity. Diversity is in every imaginable way that you could cut something up is required, including skill sets, motivations.
Okay, great. A student has asked, what does a day in the life of a data scientist look like? I know you said you're not currently a data scientist, but you've been obviously working with.
I worked, yeah.
Yeah.
I watch them.
Yeah. What's a day in life like a data scientist?
The cool thing about data science is I feel like it's right at this point where maybe 10 years ago you could answer that question, and in 10 years you could answer that question. And right now it's like everyone's just like, well, I do what I do. It's like each day is different and interesting, and that's why I think it's a cool time. An interesting, I worked on a project, back to the whole system sort of thing, and where, we just can't take the people out of the equation in human nature. The Pacific Research Platform is creating tools for scientists to use the internet around massive data projects. Like you run a particle accelerator, like the CERN particle accelerator, and you can't capture right now all the data it produces in a split second. You have to actually decide in advance what you're going to let fall off. So the idea is, how do we use the cloud and new techniques to not only wrangle the data sets of this size and these apparatus, but also make them more real time. So I've worked with people who use a certain type of microscope that produces so much data that you run it for a few seconds on a cell, and then you send your hard drives by FedEx to a supercomputer facility. And then the supercomputer, and then you have 15 minutes scheduled next week to run your analysis. And so this one experiment takes weeks. With some of these new techniques, that can be a real-time apparatus now. So it's not only like I run it and I immediately have the results, but I can actually manipulate the experiment in real time. When we give people that capability, one of the strange things is we see a 10% increase in those labs in speed of discovery when we've given them 100% increase in ability to run experiments. And one of the big reasons is the culture of the job. Those labs the whole culture was based on it would take this long to run an experiment. So the person who runs the lab shows up once a week, checks in with the grad students, like, what are we doing this week? Let's set it up. And then they work to set it up with the undergrads and all. They run their one experiment, and it's on this time frame. And the whole culture has to change to make use of this new capability. And data science is really like that. It's now like data scientists as practitioners are walking into business environments and science environments that have a culture where they didn't exist with the tool set they now have. And that tool set is right now mismatched with that culture. And that's one of, so the human nature is the bottleneck right now, as much as anything else. And that's why it's a really exciting time to work in data science.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So yeah, it's a really changing, like you said, it's going to be different a couple of years from now. Will be very different for scientists. It's interesting.
Yeah, and it's going to be it's a generation. Things like that are generational changes, because there's only so much that a 50 or 60-year-old scientist can do to change how they run their whole lab. So it's that next person taking over, and so forth. I'm not a programmer, but someone who does what I do, who's 20 years younger, is. They're not a great programmer, but they can program. I have to hire someone to do that. I can read what they do. That's a skill I had to acquire, but it was too specialized when I was coming up. And that's the same sort of thing now. So like labs you're going to go into as a scientist, it's like that. Now you have a broader skill set. So when you get into that role of managing experiments, those experiments are going to be different, because you don't have to rely as much outside of the lab, or you do rely on that, but it's more seamless integration as a team internationally or whatever than that person who's running the lab right now has ever experienced. There's only so much you can change your mindset when you've been doing it that long in the overall, how do I think about this? How do I lay it up as tasks? So, in a way it's good because it keeps us from moving too fast. I forget that a lot. I complain about it all the time, how slow we are to change. But I had a politician once tell me, some of the things we saw in voting were so simple from a technological level and so complex from a policy level to change. And he said, it cuts both ways. Our system is intended to be slow. When something moves fast, that's when we've gotten into trouble. When the pendulum swings too quickly. So it can be super frustrating that we have legacy of all these injustices, and it takes so long for them to change. But I've been to places where they've redone their whole constitution with, a movement, and the unintended consequences were vast. And I don't know if this is the best way, but it is a check and balance. So that intergenerationalness and that stuck in your wayedness actually is part of that diversity equation that's important. Because if we move too fast, we introduce too many new variables. And so the tension that we feel working together in a diverse environment, I don't want to erase it completely. I don't want people to be hurt. I don't want people to be scarred or not heard, but I do want there to be struggle, because that is actually a safeguard if it's done around specifically what we're working on versus all the baggage we bring into it. That's the difference. How do we You know, that's a constant work on yourself, work on your process and your industry thing to divide that out. But we don't want innovation environments that don't have a certain amount of anxiety and indecision and lack of groupthink. At some point, everyone starts to see that this is the same vector we should be on, and that's some of the ways you know that you're creating something that isn't going to mess it up. But that's only if you've ensured that it's not all like minds to begin with. So it's, you know, and it's three-dimensional, and there's no perfect, but I feel we get better and better, and then somebody totally ignores it and screws it up. But in general, under the scenes, I think it keeps moving to a better place.
Great. That's great. That's really interesting. And I apologize for the students that we don't have time to get to all the questions, but I want to just ask one final question for you, Dan. And that is, if you could give students one piece of advice, STEM students, science, engineering, technology, math students, one piece of advice as they you know, will be starting their careers in the near future, what would that piece of advice be?
So a friend of mine, and I call him out because I don't want to not clarify that he's been part of bringing this up, but he will immediately point out this is a centuries-old thing that he's bringing up. So he wouldn't take credit for it. Ethan Zuckerman wrote in a book of his about serendipity until very recently was an attribute and a verb. And in the dictionary primarily still is. So we in our current culture tend to think about, oh, serendipity as a happenstance, a lucky accident. These things came together and something good came of it. But the word itself comes from what would be considered an attribute of someone's character or a skill that could be honed. And what it is serendipity is the skill of being able to take advantage of the sort of happenstance and chaos around you. You know, so to see opportunity in the workings of the world, essentially. And so my whole career, I don't often give anyone advice about how to get to where I got to by looking at my career, because it was totally out of my control, except for serendipity. You know, it was always an accident. It was always like I went in and I wanted a job and they deemed me unqualified. I wasn't that. But then they're like, you're weird. Wouldn't it be interesting if you worked here? What if you did this? Or somebody who recommended to someone else who I don't even know who did the recommending. This guy has a different perspective or whatever. The thing is that I now realize the active role I played. I used to think it was almost all passive, but the active role I played was saying, that would be interesting. Let's give it a shot. I have no idea why you think this would work. I don't know what I'd do, you know, or this is how I'd do it. You don't seem very comfortable with that, but I'm still willing to give it a shot, you know, because that's how I know how to do it. And so serendipity is that skill of recognizing opportunity. And I'll add another layer to it, which I don't think is traditional, which is taking advantage of it. But I mean, that's sort of baked into the word. You recognize it and you can act upon it. And that's not something you wait for. Our culture likes to think that you wait for a lot of things to line up and then you pounce. But really, you don't know where that's going to be, what's going to be better. So you create your own opportunities by understanding what's available, what the material is. And that's what serendipity is. That's the skill to build. Storytelling, being serendipitous.
Great. Okay, so everyone, those are two skills to be working on early in your career, and I think they're both straight on. So great. I really appreciate it, Dan. It was an interesting conversation. I definitely learned a lot, and really a different way to look at some things. And I think these are important things for people early in their career to be thinking about. So I definitely appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate it. And if anyone wants to get in touch, you know, you can get my info from Lynn. I think it's better to have a conversation, and this is probably more of a spark. one of the reasons I do things like this is because also it's good for me to even just be thinking it through in this moment in time. You know, your questions, why this is part of that process, but the next process is us connecting directly. And that won't be appropriate. You know, a lot of you will be like, I don't care what he thinks about it or whatever. But if you want to connect, let's connect, because I want to have that conversation.
Okay, great. And there were several students that we didn't have time to get to your questions. So it's a great opportunity to ask one-on-one with Dan's questions. So, okay, great. So thank you very much. Thanks everyone for attending. And again, hope to see people next week. And thank you again, Dan. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.